Hi, friends. It's me again. Um, I was grateful to hear that many of you found our discussion on Thomas to be helpful and encouraging and thought provoking from last week. And I'm excited to continue on um, our pursuit of learning from unlikely figures with another figure today. From John chapter 11. This unlikely figure is going to help us explore another way to move our faith muscles, particularly when things are very hard. So, our text for today is John 11, 1 through 44. And just to set up what I'm going to share and your discussion, I'll read it for you now. Now, a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Mary was the one who anointed the Lord with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent a message to Jesus, "Lord, the one you love is ill." But when Jesus heard it, he said, "This illness does not lead to death. Rather, it is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it." Accordingly, though Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, after having heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after this, he said to his disciples, "Let us go to Judea again." The disciples said to him, "Rabbi, the Jewish leaders were just now trying to stone you, and you're going to go there again?" Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Those who walk during the day do not stumble because they see the light of this world, but those who walk at night stumble because the light is not on them." After saying this, he told them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to awaken him." The disciples said to him, "Lord, if he had fallen asleep, he will be all right." Jesus, however, had been speaking about his death, but they thought he was referring merely to sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead. For your sake, I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." Thomas, who was called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, some 2 miles away, and many of the Jewish leaders had come to Martha and Mary to console them about their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, while Mary stayed at home. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now, I know that God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world." When she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary and told her privately, "The teacher is here and is calling for you." And when she heard it, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come to the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. And the Jewish leaders who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary get up quickly and go out. They followed her because they thought that she was going to the tomb to weep there. When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jewish people who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus began to weep. So the Jews who were with her said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the man who was blind have kept this man from dying?" Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, already there is a stench because he has been dead for 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone, and Jesus looked upward and said, "Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd that is standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me." And when he said this, he cried out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, and his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." This story in John 11 often carries the heading, "Jesus raises Lazarus," or the resurrection of Lazarus. But my friend and mentor, Jaime Clark-Soles, calls it the confession of Martha. As another of my favorite John scholars, Gail O'Day, aptly described, the miracle of the raising of Lazarus is the climax of John 11, but it is not its center. The conversation between Martha and Jesus is really the theological heart of the story. The Gospel of Luke, perhaps preserving a memory of this same family, pits Mary, who sits at Jesus' feet, against Martha, who is busy attending to the affairs of the house. And Luke tells us that Mary chose the better part. John, if he is aware of Luke's tradition, flips the script, as he is often so fond of doing. Martha is the one who takes the initiative and speaks frankly. And it is the bold and busy Martha who becomes the exemplar in this story. This sister musters up a confession of faith in the midst of mourning. We'll look to her story for an example of finding hope in sadness. You might call it good grief. Martha goes out to meet Jesus with a complaint. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." We can picture the grief, the confusion, and the anger in Martha's voice. The assumption behind Martha's statement, which is also echoed by Mary later, they find voice through the mourners who meet them at the tomb. Could not the one who opened the eyes of the man who was blind have kept our friend from dying? The grief is palpable. Mary's grief even keeps her at home until Jesus calls her directly. Met by Jesus, both sisters weep, and Jesus joins them in their grief. And this is not an insignificant detail. The Johannine Jesus, the Word who became flesh, the pre-existent one before time, the one who is equal to the Father, who is divine, who is always in control. In this story, we see him overcome by grief. The one who is the resurrection and the life, the one who we might presume knows that he will soon call his friend Lazarus from the tomb, he still weeps for his beloved friend. He is so moved that some in the crowd exclaim, "See how he loved him." But even now, I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him, Martha says. Even now. It is in her grief that Martha exercises hopeful faith. When Jesus promises that Lazarus will rise again, Martha thinks in eschatological terms. She looks ahead to the resurrection that she believed would come at the end of all things. And Jesus brings her focus back to the present and back to him. "I am the resurrection and the life," he says. "Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who believes in me will never die." Those who believe will never die. Of course, they will die. Everyone dies. Lazarus died, and he will likely die again. Even Jesus will die. Jesus seems to be speaking in contradictory terms here. But maybe this kind of dialectical back and forth thinking, holding these things in tension, is necessary when we're trying to have hope in the midst of grief. In fact, it is Jesus' death in John that introduces this great paradox: victory in death, salvation in crucifixion, hope in the midst of grief. Jesus doesn't promise physical life without physical death. He promises an experience of abundant life that swallows up the sting of death. We might think of the prophet Hosea's words, "Where is your indictment, death? Where is your sting?" With images that find echoes throughout John's gospel, Hosea speaks of times past when God provided food in the desert, like Jesus multiplied the bread in John 6. God provided water in the wilderness, like Jesus provided living water in John chapter 4 and John chapter 7. Hosea looks to a time yet to come when Israel's abundance will be like a vineyard of ripened vines, ready to press out tons of fine wine. Sort of like the wine that Jesus provided in John chapter 2. We see in Hosea, sometimes the past and the future are more hope-filled than the present. Like Martha, we all grieve. And I don't know about you, but this is not a grief-free time period for me. So I want to acknowledge that as we look at this passage, and I want to see this story of Martha and this figure of Martha as an invitation to give that grief the space that it deserves. Like Martha, we may wish to escape the present grief by looking far ahead, or we might wish to escape the grief by gazing back at the past. Like Martha, we are invited, though, in the present, to find hope, even in the midst of grief. Even now, as Martha claims, life even in death, as Jesus promises. She claims, "I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one who is coming into the world." It is the presence of Jesus that gives Martha this hope in the midst of grief. Theodicy, the confession of God's goodness amidst experiences that make evil undeniable. Theodicy is a tall order, especially in times like the time we're in now. We often cry to God with Mary and Martha, "If only you had been here." Martha encourages us to believe that God is the one who moves into the world. With all of its darkness, with all of its brokenness, with all of its grief, Martha reminds us that even in the unanswered questions and the unmet requests, we are not alone. The Gospel of John reminds us that God joined our human experience of loss and death in the person and the incarnation of Jesus. The ironic suggestion from Thomas, "Let us go with him that we may die with him," is full of meaning here. As Jesus moves towards Jerusalem, he is moving towards death. We are not spared from suffering just because we follow Jesus. We join suffering when we follow Jesus. The presence of Jesus can, I think, bring a quality of life and hope that takes away some of the significance, some of the sting of the significant loss that we experience in life. With Hosea, we can begin to ask, "Where, death, is your sting?" and hope and believe that even though we die, we live. Even when we grieve, we have hope because we are not alone. To end your time today, I'd like to share with you a few things that have been really helpful for me during this time and through other times in my life where I've experienced suffering and grief. You may have heard of mindfulness. Mindfulness is a type of practice where we pay special attention to our emotions, to our thoughts, and to how those are connected to our body. Mindful self-compassion is a certain form of mindfulness for people who are suffering or in times of great loss or great grief. And it's especially helpful for people who tend to be critical of themselves when they feel pain or when they experience grief. So in order to make some space for your grief, I'm going to encourage you to look at some resources for mindful self-compassion. The first is a link that you'll have included in this study, which is from Stanford Magazine. It's a short illustrated video that gives you 6 ways to exercise self-compassion. Those 6 ways, just to briefly summarize, are first of all, don't suppress your feelings. Second, be vulnerable, even when it's uncomfortable. Third, remember that you're human. I sometimes have to rephrase this to say, accept your limitations as a human. Number 4, rewrite the negative script that is in your head. Number 5, stop the cycle of worst case scenarios. And finally, find a way to self-soothe. These last 3 steps are easier said than done: rewriting negative scripts and stopping the worst case scenario thinking and soothing yourself. And so the last piece, the last resource I'd like to point you to is selfcompassion.org. There are a number of exercises on this website that you can just turn on and follow to practice self-compassion. There's one that's, I think, only a minute or 2 long, and it talks you through the 3 steps of mindful self-compassion. They follow along 3 phrases, and I'm going to repeat these phrases to you, and I'm going to encourage you to make the space today to repeat these phrases to yourself. It's really weird at first, but to get alone and to repeat these phrases to yourself and to offer yourself that space for grief. The first phrase that we say in mindful self-compassion is, "This is a moment of suffering." This is a moment of suffering. Saying this to ourselves is a way of reminding ourselves that we do have feelings. It's allowing us to acknowledge those feelings and to own them. This is a moment of suffering. The second phrase is, "Suffering is a part of life." Suffering is a part of life helps us to remember that we are not alone in our suffering, that other people suffer, that it's not abnormal for us to feel pain or grief or to feel hopeless in times like these. Suffering is a part of life. And then finally, we repeat to ourselves, "May I be kind to myself in this moment." This is really where rewriting those negative scripts comes into play. Once we have acknowledged our pain, once we see that suffering is a part of life, we're still at risk for judging ourselves, for needing the space, for feeling the pain. And so we say, "May I be kind to myself in this moment." The meditation that I suggested that you look up at selfcompassion.org actually leads you through talking with yourself to comfort yourself as you would talk to a friend. To say, it's okay to feel how you're feeling. to actually care for yourself. So I hope that you will check out the short video from Stanford Magazine, which kind of lets you stay distant from this practice and check it out at first, what it's all about. And then also go to selfcompassion.org and look at some of those exercises. They have meditations, they have writing exercises, many different forms that these can take. But let me encourage you to make some space for the grief that is inevitably invading your life right now in our current circumstances, so that you might be able to find some hope and to exercise your faith muscles even in these challenging times.